Recently, someone I was speaking with suggested that my novel is a grief memoir. And I suppose that as the person writing from the inside out, any attempt I make to refute the allegation is suspect. But that won't stop me from trying. A grief memoir requires that grief be the organizing principle, and C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed is a conspicuous example in my mind. In contrast, my novel's protagonist presents her life as the center of gravity, the way she moves and interacts with the world, the choices she makes, the way she sees other human beings. In other words, her story is told through the lens of how she becomes herself. But isn't there death? Of course, and her death matters. First, because her life mattered. Another way to frame this is with a question: if Beth never died, would the story I'm telling still be worth telling? And in a word, yes. Because Beth is not defined by dying, she is defined by living. Now, I imagine some will resist my effort to clarify the category by asking, well, don't you find yourself weeping when you write? Unequivocally, yes. Often, and sometimes copiously. But those tears most often are rooted in moments when I experience transcendent joy to have known this person and one other who saw me or sees me completely and invited me or invites me to see them in return. This is the very root of joy. If it is not a grief memoir or a memoir of any kind, why write it? I find that Beth is an example of how a human being can live. In my story, she happens to be a woman, and her womanhood certainly shapes the narrative. What makes her remarkable, though, isn't that she's a woman, it's how she lives. She pays attention, she's courageous, she's generous, she refuses to manipulate people. And more than anything else, she has the rare ability to see another person without immediately trying to change them. In this regard, the novel is not about grief. It's about recognition. Sometimes, as many, or I imagine most writers do, I have fantasies. I imagine a 22-year-old reader walking into a bookstore. Why not? They do not know my personal story. They pick up the book because, despite what we may wish, the cover draws them in. They begin reading. Maybe they don't finish it that day, or maybe they stay up absurdly late. Then, and this is what matters, to the writer at least, a few months later, they sit across the table at Starbucks from somebody they love. And instead of trying to fix them, they listen. Maybe they see in the one they love a strength that they had previously overlooked. They won't think, that book taught me how to be human. They simply start behaving more humanely. Rivers of Mercy, the title, doesn't sound like a book about grief. Rivers flow, mercy is given. The book moves toward life even when confronted with death. So in my fantasy, if that reader 20 years later pulls that worn paperback from a shelf and says, I've never met anyone quite like Beth, but I hope I become more like her, or I wish I could love someone the way these two learned to love each other, then I think my book will have accomplished exactly what I set out to do. And for the curious, these books contain two strikingly different women who achieve and demonstrate the same measure of humanity.